Most games are a simulation of something in the real world. They're attempting to represent something in the real world and represent it in game mechanisms, right? So you go look at something like war or fighting or farming or racing or whatever, and then you make some representation of it in the form of a game simulation. You create this interactive experience that allows the player to kind of embody the thing that you wanted to represent. What's so interesting about this to me is that you have to decide which characteristics, which aspects of the real life thing you want to bring over and actually implement as game mechanisms and rules to actually represent the thing that you want to do. And you have to be extremely selective about which things you actually bring over and implement as game mechanisms. So I've been thinking about this a lot because I've been reading this big giant textbook, Rules of Play, which is this really great book that is kind of the first, like, as far as I'm aware, like formal game design textbook. And it's not so much like how you do game design, but it's more like understanding kind of and building a vocabulary of how games work and what they are. It's really interesting. It's kind of dry, but there's a lot of really interesting stuff. And they started walking through these different units of like, here's a bunch of lenses to understand games. Here's like games as narratives. Here's like games as just like the experience of pleasure. And then I got to this unit that I've been thinking about a lot, which is like, here's games as simulations. And they were talking about this, about how selective games have to be. And it really got my wheels turning. Like chess, if we go back to that, chess is the simulation of war, right? If we think about what war really is, it's this like crazy combination of geopolitics and violence and national interests and geography and human bodies and weapons and technology. None of that stuff is in the game of chess, right? Chess very selectively picked a couple of important aspects of war, specifically like positioning and like the specialization of units. And turned that into a brilliant game that when you look at it from the outside, if you had no idea what it was, you wouldn't have any sense that it had anything to do with war. But as a player, actually engaging with its mechanisms and its rules, you do experience something where you feel like a tactician. You feel like you're moving pieces around. It's this like zero-sum game between you and your opponent, and you're trying to outsmart them. And it conveys some aspect of war that is important. A lot of games you can kind of break down this way. And I think this is really interesting because by just taking a couple of key aspects and packaging them up in this tight game, chess was able to communicate something about war to us. And I think that's really amazing and kind of beautiful. So I'm thinking about this because I am working on a game right now that I'm not quite ready to talk about, which is a direct simulation of a real life thing that pretty much everyone is familiar with. And I'm trying to figure out in real time which parts of that thing I bring over into my simulation representation of it. But I do want to talk about a different game that did this really well and also made me think about this a lot more. And it's this giant box, Heat, which is a game about racing. Heat is one of my favorite new games of the last few years. I guess it's really not that new anymore. It was so exciting to get because it was really back ordered at the time. And then when I finally got it, it lived up to the hype and we love it so much. So Heat is a game about racing. And it's so interesting to me because if you asked me to design a game about racing, like about car racing specifically, I might immediately start kind of inventorying all the different aspects of racing that I might simulate. And I might immediately be drawn towards things like steering or like kind of like maneuvering around your opponents or stepping on the gas pedal or different things like that. And, you know, you start to kind of just look at like what are the obvious parts of racing a car that really like stand out to me. We need to implement all of them as mechanisms. And you could imagine going really far down this road of saying, let's just kind of move it closer and closer to reality by implementing all of the parts of car racing. And you might get towards something like a video game like Forza Horizon. I never know how to say it. Forza Horizon, Forza Horizon. You have these games that are these like hyper realistic simulators of driving a car. You even have trucking simulator and like flight simulator, even mowing simulator. You have all these different simulators that try to get closer and closer to reality. They try to get closer and closer to the thing that they're representing People even make these immersive VR simulations where you can, I keep on seeing this on YouTube and Instagram and stuff, is these guys in these like trucker rigs at home, and it like really almost looks and feels like they're driving a truck and their seat is rumbling. And like, that is really interesting. It is amazing to see what technology can do. And that is one way to approach a simulation, is like, how close can we get to the actual sensation of flying a Boeing 737, whatever. I don't know anything about planes. I probably just embarrassed myself by saying a fake number. That's one way to approach simulations. It's totally valid. It's interesting. It's cool to see what video games are able to do there. But you can't fit that inside of a cardboard box. You aren't afforded all those opportunities to do such a large scale, detailed simulation. And so I actually, from a game design perspective, I'm really interested in actually the other direction. Instead of like, hey, how close can we get to the real thing? I'm much more interested in the chess version of it, which is which handful of little tiny characteristics can we pull out and repackage for you in a way that you will experience some aspect that really does make you feel like you are at war. And I think that this is what Heat does in a really surprising and interesting way. Instead of focusing on the mechanisms of driving a car, like here's your pedal, here's your wheel, go take this corner, oh, you didn't take the corner well. Instead, the central mechanism that they focus on is how much heat is in your engine, which I also love, by the way, that the title of the game basically tells you that. And so it's this idea that basically, if you're racing a car, you're going to be pushing the hardware of your car to its limit. And as you do that, you add more heat into your engine. If you take a hard turn really fast, if you speed up faster than your opponents, if you do all these different kind of risky maneuvers, you gradually put wear and tear, you put heat into your engine. And so then later on, you necessarily need to have moments where you're being a bit more conservative and driving a little bit slower to let the heat cool off, right? And so the whole game is really just where do I pick my spots where I'm going to be risky, where I'm going to intentionally put heat into my engine. I'm going to push my hardware, because if I never push it, I'll just be lagging in last place. But if I push too hard, I'm going to spin out and my car's going to break down. And that is the thing that they narrowed in on. They narrowed in on something that I've never seen really in hardly any racing games. I mean, I'm sure that there's spinning out and burning out in other games, but they said this is the central mechanism of this board game. And the funny thing is, there's all this stuff that they left out. Like, there's not even a concept of steering in Heat. One of the very first things that I would think of is like, let's simulate racing, let's put this in there. It's not even in the game because it doesn't really need to be in there. Instead, they said, we're going to narrow in really close on this one interesting aspect, which we are able to represent in a cardboard box, which is pushing your luck, pushing your hardware as hard as it can go, but then also backing off at the right time. And it's basically a timing game. And that is so interesting to me because it really just goes completely in the opposite direction of these hardcore real life simulations. I sort of think that picking and choosing which characteristics, which things you keep in the game is where some of the real artistry of game design comes in. I think about this because I was thinking about like photography, for example, or making a movie, where a lot of the artistry of good photography is simply deciding what's in frame and what's not. I mean, there's a lot of other parts to it, but that is kind of the key thing, is like what's in the frame. And depending on what is in the frame, also like 99.99% of the rest of your surroundings are not in the frame, right? And that's a really important and critical choice as a photographer. And that's part of what makes like the frame interesting, the frame of a movie, the painting, like deciding what's in frame and what's not in frame is kind of this essential piece of taste, piece of insight that you get from an artist. And I think that it works really the same way in game design, that the game designers of Heat were able to look at car racing and say they narrowed in on this one thing that no one else had really made a whole game about. And they said, how hot your engine is an interesting enough characteristic in this real life thing of car racing that we could make a whole game about it, and you will feel like a car racer by managing the heat in your engine. And that's an amazing insight. And I love it so much. So I'm thinking about this a lot. And now I'm looking at each game that I play and saying, what did they choose to keep in the frame? What did they leave out of the frame? And what's fascinating is it's not obviously a one size fits all answer. Like Flight Simulator is an incredibly popular, amazing technical achievement. It's fun to play. It's really cool to even just watch on YouTube. And going in that direction of saying, we're going to put absolutely as much as possible into the frame and make you manage it and make you basically learn how to fly a plane, versus Heat, which says we're going to put almost nothing in the frame so that you are forced to focus in on this one weird little aspect of how cars work. And that's going to be what's interesting about it. Both of them work. It's pretty interesting. So it's just one more lens to think about the games that I'm playing, and I'm really liking it.